I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Lauren Christensen and I have known each other more than a minute, but we are on opposite sides of the screen right now because Lauren has written her first memoir. It's called Firstborn, and it is a story of grief and motherhood and coming of age and all sorts of interesting, beautiful, poetic things. And I've read the memoir now actually 3 times, which is more than I usually do. The first time I flew through it because of the way you write. The second time I read it because I needed to reread it for me. And the third time I reread it because I was prepping for the show. And it's your first book. And I know you've been writing and editing for a while, but I'm going to ask you to set it up because it's not your most typical grief memoirs we've seen. Like, it's not, I think folks are familiar with Joan Didion and Geraldine Brooks, but the death of a spouse is a little different, yeah?
Yeah, it was a very specific story that kind of just obviously came to my life. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Miwa. I've long been a fan of this show, and I'm just really honored to be here. And thank you for reading the book 3 times. I don't know that I've read the book 3 times. I'm kidding.
But I was about to say,
really,
no,
it's really
I know
impressive.
You've read it more than
So yeah, set it up. So yes, as I've been an editor at the Times Book Review for like, I don't know, 7.5 years now. So I have a lot of contact with books. I have been on your side of the interviewing many times. And so this is a kind of unfamiliar position for me to be in. If you read the book, it's pretty clear. I wasn't kind of looking around for a story to write. This just happened. I was pregnant in the fall of 2022, and about 5 months into the pregnancy, I learned that my daughter she had a genetic abnormality that meant she was not going to survive. At the time, I was living in North Carolina. They had recently changed their laws to limit abortions after 20 weeks and 6 days or something. So around exactly where I was. And as a result, I had to leave the state, which was fortunately not difficult for me because I am from New York. I had just moved to North Carolina with my husband, and my whole family's in New York, so it wasn't difficult for me to find care. That is what happened. The book goes into what I consider extensive detail in that story, and I guess the point I want to make is that I just started writing it not as a book. I just started writing when I couldn't do anything else when I came home from the hospital. And I was on leave from my job for 6 weeks, which was such a godsend. Everyone I work with was just so gentle and generous with me in that time. And so I did have time to think about what happened and process and physically recover, but mentally just process what happened. And part of that was writing this. And it's very immediate, going back and reading what I wrote now, I don't feel the same way about everything that I wrote then, but I wanted to preserve it because that was kind of the point of writing it so immediately. I wanted to remember what it felt like in that moment, even if I might have different feelings about it now, 2 years later.
There was a lot that I learned about you that I didn't previously know. And some of it I'm going to let readers discover on their own. I think, and it's really interesting hearing you say that you've changed your mind about certain pieces of the story. I mean, I assumed you would be writing about this. I didn't know we were going to get the book this quickly. Having heard what had happened, I assumed there would be, because if you work with words, of course, this is how you're going to process what happened to your family. And the way your sentences unfold, I was only gently teasing you a second ago when I was like, of course you've read this book more than once. I've read it. There is no way. Maybe the first draft came out in a rush of words to preserve the moment. But as a reader, there is no way this was not picked apart and put together and picked apart and put together and picked apart and put together. How does it feel, though, to have it out in the world?
Oh, I don't know how it feels.
Okay. That's fair.
It feels different every day. I mean, honestly, there have been periods. So first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to my editors. I had two editors at Penguin Press, Helen Rauner and Scott Moyers, who are just, I mean, about as sharp and brilliant as you can hope for in editors, but they're also deeply kind. And the editing process was just, it still felt so intimate. You know, it felt like I felt so taken care of. So that process of picking apart, it didn't feel like hard labor. It actually felt like really important, meaningful work with two people who I feel like I learned so much about editing from them. Putting it out into the world is a different story. You know, I mean, talking to just two editors in private, it was extremely safe and comfortable, and preparing to kind of hear what strangers think about not just, you know, the prose and the sentences, but what happened, what we did is immensely terrifying to me. And, you know, there are some days that I just really have to remind myself, you know, I didn't do this for some kind of, you know, publicity. Like, I know publicity is important as our, you know, we're here. And obviously I'm in this business. I understand that books need to be publicized, but that isn't why I did it. I didn't do it for career reasons. I didn't do it, you know, it was really to preserve her and to preserve this moment and kind of make her exist forever in this way that is a really kind of sad approximation for a human being, but it's all I could do. So when I get really nervous about, you know, what people are going to say, from strangers to people I know, you know, just I just have to remember that I want the book to live on a shelf somewhere for someone to pick up when they need it, or just happen across it, and I just want it to be on a shelf somewhere. That's what I feel.
I do, though, as a reader and as a bookseller, I appreciate a good grief memoir. I think part of where we're standing as a culture right now and as a society is our inability to talk about grief on a large scale.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I say this as a half Japanese Bostonian. Like, I mean, I am not known for being demonstrably emotional. Like, that's what gin was invented for. To watch how people handle, and I'm going to use Didion as an example, Sloane Crosley as an example, and certainly Geraldine Brooks. I think those are probably three of the best known grief memoirs out there. You also talk about Elizabeth McCracken's book about the stillbirth of one of her children. But I think that terrain sort of sets the landscape for us, right? And about a larger conversation about grief, and that, you know, somehow grief is something that women are supposed to talk about, and only us. And I'm kind of like, well, we've got to give everyone the language to talk about this, because it is something that is universal. We all experience it regardless of age. You can experience grief for any number of things, right? And whether it's a parent or a sibling or a loved one or your spouse or partner or whatever, but it can also run in a deeper cultural way.
Yeah, completely.
We're a little messy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't actually go into, I have a lot of thoughts in response to what you just said. And a lot of them are not in the book. I intentionally, like, I ended the book pretty soon after Simone, my daughter, died. I didn't want to really go into the kind of more medium term, let alone longer term aftermath of what it felt like to kind of try to reemerge into like normal life for me, for my husband. It was difficult. Some people were really not just willing, but like capable of talking to us. And others just really weren't. And it's not like an anger or resentment or anything. It really, you feel it so palpably when, like, I didn't have another register beyond grieving for a while.
But going back to the stuff you left out, right? Like silence, obviously, big part of grief, big part of mourning are these giant silences, right? And then there are the people who are just like, well, I have to talk into the silence because I can't handle the silence.
Or this feeling like, I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to remind you and make it hard for you. Which I understand that it all comes from a genuine place. There's a profound kind of disconnect. I just felt this so strongly. I mean, I write also in this book about it's, the grief is not only for my daughter. My grandfather also passed away like 2 weeks before we found out Simone was dying. He was 94. He lived a full, beautiful life. He had Parkinson's, but it was, by all accounts, it was a natural, kind of beautiful death. I just can't explain to you how different the responses were. I mean, people who were so able to say to him, I'm so sorry about your grandfather, what a beautiful life he had. He was so lucky to be surrounded by his whole family who just didn't know how to talk about losing a baby. And I think that comes, I mean, there's a real reticence on the part of women, like, or, just people who have lost pregnancies feel like they can't talk about it, right? This whole stigma that you're not supposed to, I don't know if stigma is the right word, but this, just this kind of informal rule that you're not supposed to tell people that you're pregnant until 12 weeks. It's like, who's is to protect other people or to protect me? I'm genuinely not sure. And so I think, from the beginning, I felt like this discomfort because I am comfortable talking. Like I do like to share. And I think sometimes my family and I are a little at odds with that. They're not like, why are you talking so much about yourself and us and whatever? But that's just how I am. And so much about pregnancy, let alone pregnancy loss, felt like it needed to be kind of shrouded and private. And that was always uneasy for me.
I'm going to come back to the sentences for a second, though, and I'm going to come back to the way you write, because, again, you're talking about a loss that not everyone has experienced, but becomes a very universal. I think there's a way to understand this, that even if you have not been pregnant yourself or, lost a child immediately, that the overwhelming sense of change, right? Like there's a before and after. Mm-hmm. There's an absolute before and after. And, sort of being on the page with you as you are going through this process and that hinge moment, right? You've clearly been thinking about writing and telling stories in a way that maybe not everyone who's been in your position has, which is partially why Firstborn really swings the way it does. And swing may sound like a strange way to describe this book, but again, I'm going back to the prose. I'm going back to the way you are talking about the people who are immediately in your family in this story, a couple of whom I've met off the page in various circumstances. And there's so much life in this book. There's so much life, and there's so much character, and there's so much compassion and empathy and sympathy, all of the things that you want, right? In the kind of book that you're going to sit with and think, I am probably not going to be the same person after I finish reading this.
Thank you.
Sure. And I don't say that because I know you, I don't say that because you and I know each other out in the world. Speaking, as a reader experiencing the work. But I do want to talk about influences, and I do want to talk about how you got here, because yes, you had great editors, without a doubt. I know both of them by reputation, but you still have to have you had to give them something to work with, because this could have been a really different book, right? But knowing you and how you operate in the world and the kinds of books that you like, I have a pretty good idea of how we got here, but I'm going to ask you to share that with listeners.
So as you mentioned, I write in the book about stumbling on Elizabeth McCracken's memoir. It's called An Exact Replica of a Figment of My Imagination. She wrote it in 2008. And honestly, I didn't know about it until it was the morning of my grandfather's memorial service. And I was just kind of by myself on a walk, and I was looking for an audiobook to kind of just fill my head. And I found this, and these stories, it's not like it made anything better, right? It didn't make the grief go away, but that's not the purpose. It made me feel less alone. And, as trite as that, I mean, it did. The way she was articulating exact feelings that I was having in my head. For example, people were kind of nervous about mentioning their own children or other children or whatever. And I don't want your child, I'm so happy for you. I'm not kind of just mourning like motherhood. I'm mourning like a specific baby, and she says something to that effect. And it was something that I hadn't really fully articulated, and she just did so beautifully. And there are a million other instances of that. It just felt, this stranger, of course I knew of her, but I didn't know her personally. I felt so close to her. in that experience. And so that I wouldn't say in that moment, I wasn't like, oh, I want to write a memoir like she did. It wasn't so conscious like that, but it has been in my mind since the first time I listened to it. And of course it influenced the way I was thinking about writing. I mean, I've long been a fan of Joan Didion's grief memoirs, particularly Blue Nights, about the death of her daughter. I think there's an obliqueness to her writing, specifically in that book, that I felt so moved by, because you could just feel that there were subjects, even though she was writing about this subject, there were aspects of it she couldn't touch. And you could feel that in her resistance in some places. And I felt that writing too, just, okay, I know I'm writing this story and there's some things I can just talk about endlessly. And then there are just some moments that I don't know what happened. I don't know who I was then. I can't make sense of it. And so that was a big inspiration for me, her writing. I will say also, it's so kind that you're saying that there's, so much character and life in the book. That is a real credit to my agent, Bill Clegg, who read this before anyone did. And, when he read it, it was really more of a diary. Like, it was kind of linear of what had happened with Simone, beginning and ending with Simone. And he was like, there's more here.
Mm-hmm.
This is a story. And he really smartly was kind of the one to say, I think this is about your mother. I don't even know about her, but I feel that you're dancing around this subject. And so that was a huge seismic shift in what the book was, when I realized I had to bring in the subject of my own, who I am as a daughter, right?
That is part of what I love about Firstborn, because you are also your mother's firstborn. Your daughter was going to be the fourth generation of girls in your family.
Yeah,
you and I both come from families where there are a lot of girls. But at the same time, sometimes it's complicated in Asian families, right?
Yeah.
And I loved watching you sort of figure out where you stood with your mom, but also where your mom stood with you, because obviously your relationship changed. Here you are about to become a parent, and your mom's kind of looking at this sideways going, wait a minute, how is my child? Right?
Yeah.
And watching this happen. And okay, does it hurt that your agent is also a novelist and a memoirist in his own right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But I love the idea that there's a certain amount of collaboration that comes into the creation of a book like this, right?
Hugely,
like you've got to step out for a second. And here you are, also the person who has shaped other people's prose for at least 7. It's a really different set of muscles in a way, because
completely.
I write a ton of copy and I still need an editor. And when I say I write a ton of copy, like I can write a shelf talker like nobody's, but I still need an editor, because sometimes you throw something out there and you're like, ooh.
Everybody needs an editor. I actually think, like, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for my editor's experience of working with me, but I hope they didn't find that I pushed back on anything, because I really do feel like I believe in in the importance of that objective perspective, and that outside expertise, especially with a book like this. Like, it's not even a plot. It's not a novel that I made up, that I can even see, or a biography of somebody else that you can hopefully approach with a little bit more of a bird's eye view. Like, I am so in this. I don't know what's interesting about this story. I don't know. The whole thing is just kind of what happened. So, I had instincts of what to put in and what to leave out, things that were just important to me on an emotional level. But in terms of narrative arc, like, I need someone to tell me, okay, Lauren, that's not pertinent. You know what I mean? Or, you don't know how this is coming off. Like, that was so important when it's my life, this isn't just, it's not just narrative.
Well, and you're handing over an intimacy to people you have seriously never met. I really respect the reading experience, right? Like, this is a thing. When you get deep into a book, and okay, audiobooks, same thing. Like, if you get deep into an audiobook, I prefer to read on paper, but I will read however I need to. It's just when you do what I do, sometimes stuff is done on the fly.
Exactly.
Being able to be part of a narrative and think that you know someone. And again, I know I hinted at this at the top of the show. I did learn stuff about you that you as a teenager and a younger 20-something, where I was like, oh, never would have guessed that, but okay. totally understand. But, you work at a newspaper. I mean, the first thing you're taught when you work at a newspaper is take yourself out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yes.
there's a lot that I know now. But I love the idea that you can do that because you've got the right people working with you to say, hey, wait a minute, you didn't actually put enough out into the world. And that's wild to me, right? But that's why we read. We read to get into someone else's head or someone else's shoes or, to experience something that we kind of have words for, but not quite.
Yeah. And I want to be clear, like, no one was pushing me to like divulge things that I wasn't comfortable. It was more just like, you're already saying this without saying it is the kind of, like that takes a really keen eye as an editor, as an agent, whatever, to read something and say, there is something like beneath this that I feel like is being deliberately shrouded, but you can't actually hide it. Do you know what I mean? I'm speaking so abstractly.
No, I don't think you are,
like,
because
this is here.
I think it's a generational shift too. I think younger people are kind of like, completely. Why are we not talking about this? Why are we not having these conversations? And, I grew up, with lots of people.
Am I a younger person?
I mean, technically not that much, but I'm just thinking about the people I grew up with, right? Who were just like, well, we don't talk about certain things. I'm like, yes. Are you kidding me? Like, we really, like, how much longer are we going to continue to do this? And I think you saw that to a certain extent with your grandparents. I mean, your mom to a certain extent.
Yeah, my mom. Yeah. And I'm really grateful to my mom for letting me write about her. She is a private person. And
yes, she is.
It is a real act of her love for me and for Simone to let me do this.
But I think your mom, too, is a really terrific entry point into a narrative that some people might not know how they feel about it. And then I meet your mom and I'm like, I could hang out with you on the sofa. I could totally hang out with you over dinner.
She's amazing.
She was really ahead of her time in a lot of ways, too. Like, I knew a little bit about her, but now I'm kind of like, oh, yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Working mom, like early working mom, right? In a way that.
Yeah.
Definitely ahead of her time.
Yeah, and single for much of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely.
Just watching her figure out sort of how she needed to approach this for you. It's not just you figuring stuff out. It's mom too. And I like that push and pull.
And I don't know if this is kind of as a spoiler that my mom had gone through a loss too. And I vaguely knew about it, but we did not talk about it very much. It wasn't this a secret by any means, but it just wasn't, it wasn't so present. And for her to be going, reliving all of that through this lens of watching me suffer the same thing she didn't really have words for at that time. If I made up this story, you'd be like, this is a little too much. You know what I mean?
I don't think like this would work as a novel. I genuinely don't think this would work as a novel.
It's too sad.
Yeah.
You'd have to lighten it up a little.
There's some stories that you can muck around with the format, right? Like you could tell some things as a play or, a poem or a novel or a short story. And then there's some stuff where it's like, no, I kind of need to keep this grounded because you might not believe it otherwise.
And I think it will still be too sad for a lot of people to read, which I totally respect.
Right.
Like, everyone should know going into this that it's not fun.
Okay, I'm actually, hold on, bookseller here for a second.
I guess I'm not selling the books.
Yeah, no. But it's not even, yes, I realize what my job title is, but yes, it is sad. Yes, it is deeply emotional, but I still feel like it's a very hopeful narrative. Even though we end at a point where you're still clearly getting things sorted out. Watching you and your husband and his family and your family get to the other side with multiple layers of grief, I think ultimately is a really hopeful approach. And it felt very honest to me. And, again, there were some moments that I had heard off to the side before I read them on the page, but as a reading experience, right, I felt very, very grounded in what was happening. Because you gave us, like, the happy weird. Because there's also, like, can we just be honest? There's happy weird in this book.
Yeah.
But, like, that's reality, right? Like, we have to have both. Like, we don't get to move through the world without having the powerful grief and the exceptional joy, right? Like that's all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an interesting decision to end it where I did. I did not want to go into the fact that I did end up having another child, I who is alive and healthy and beautiful. And that was a decision that kind of, people asked me a number of times, are you sure you don't want to just add a afterword or something? And he gets to live. And I think also I didn't want to collapse them into one story about my motherhood, that they exist separately. So that was kind of one instance of like a lightness or a happiness that I didn't really, it didn't feel so honest to the book because it was just a separate chapter. And I had a hard enough time moving through
right,
the grief into the hope for the second pregnancy. But that was a really tough decision, kind of feeling like, am I doing right by both of them? And I think ultimately, like, if he wants to write about his life, he can write about his life. I don't want to take that from him. I don't want to write about him without his consent. So,
I mean, given who his parents are, there is a decent chance that the kid might end up with a way with words.
Or he'll just refuse any kind of literary life at all.
Entirely
some kind
possible.
of scientist.
Entirely possible. I suspect, however, I mean, listen, given also the whole, medical part of his paternal family, I'm just like, well, a lot of doctors go on to be writers. I mean, Abraham.
Not untrue. Yes,
Khaled
totally.
Hosseini, Paul Cullen. He could do lots of things.
But no pressure for him.
And he could also just be like, yeah, peace out. I'm not doing any of this. Bye-bye. Yeah. Anything is possible. But I'm just listening to you say all of that. And part of it for me, because obviously I'm coming from the outside entirely, I'm like, no, that makes perfect sense from a narrative standpoint. I'm like,
yeah,
the experience of reading Firstborn. And again, I know I keep describing it as an experience, but it's not just a simple sit down and read. First time, straight through. Second time, a little bit of put it down because I needed to, go stare at a wall for a second. And then the third time, when you're prepping for something like this, you're reading in an entirely different way. So, and you know that. Like, there's I'm reading for pure pleasure. I'm reading for enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, right? And then there's I'm reading for work.
Homework.
And reading for work, like, I mean, I'm certainly not complaining. I have a pretty groovy way of making a living.
No, I hear you. You had more work to do to prepare for this than I did. It's kind of nice being on this side.
Yeah, right? Right? Because I was thinking about it, I was like, oh, yeah, we're going to hit all of these. I mean, I have a rough sort of outline in my head, but it also was one of those interviews where I was like, okay, we're just going to sort of hang out and see where this takes us. Because, again, it all does come back to the words, right? And telling a story and what you're telling a story about and who you're telling the story about and how you're telling it and who's going to pick it up or not. It's wild to me that this book is out. I'm just the timeline, right? It's a very compressed timeline. It is.
Yeah.
And again, it makes all the sense in the world to me. I mean, when I think about, too, how quickly Didion turned around Year of Magical Thinking. Same thing. I'm like, it was less than a year, if I remember.
But then took decades to write about her daughter.
Right. And that's kind of fascinating to me.
Completely. She couldn't touch it.
Yeah. And what I'm hoping is that people are willing to come to the story, especially because it is Simone's story. I mean, yes, it's yours too and your mom's, but it is Simone's story. Just to be open-minded, right?
Yeah.
I feel like we haven't seen and I've read McCracken's memoir, and I read it ages ago when it first came out because I was like, wow, I can't believe she's writing.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really different kind of story of grief.
Yeah. I mean, I'm incredibly nervous about what the responses will be. I mean, I think it's extremely helpful to have a husband who has gone through the publicity process twice with two different books. And, and the second book, I was in his life and really up close saw what it can do to a person. and his books are fiction. They're not his direct life, and it is very helpful to have seen what it can feel like, how vulnerable it can be. This is the first time I've ever put anything out there for people to judge, right? I mean, I'm usually judging, like I'm usually critiquing other people's books, and it does make you think, like, God, it's so brutal what we do. These are people's books that we're picking apart, but it's important. But art needs to be received. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it. I'm nervous.
But I also think that sometimes art is the only lens we have that lets us tell the truth.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I want it to exist no matter what.
Right.
Yeah.
Memoir is an art, right? Like it is. There are plenty of people who will be like, well, it's all made up. People have big feelings about people have big feelings about books. They have big feelings about books. They have big feelings about memoir. They have big feelings about lots of things. But I love the idea that we, and I mean collective we as like a culture and a society, right, can sit down with books and put ourselves in a place to have experiences that we might not otherwise have. Mm-hmm. Or have experiences that we have had and find our tribe, as it were, right? Mm-hmm. Like all of these things. I think that intimacy of reading a book is kind of magic, right? No matter what it is. Like, I am one of those people who genuinely believes that there's a book out there for everyone, right? Like,
oh yeah, yeah, and at every period in their lives, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Oh, man, there's some stuff that I've gone back to that I loved when I was 18. I'm like, oh, dear.
What was I thinking?
Oh, boy. No, I understand exactly what I was thinking. I was a product of my place and time.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of things where I was like, oh, man. Oh, okay.
Well, I have this whole category of books that I read before I started this job, honestly, and I loved them, and I don't want to go back and read them because I think I've just become so much more like, I don't know, curmudgeonly or like cynical about stuff. Like I used to love like most books that I read. And now I'm just like, well, this is too whatever. This is too whatever. It's less fun.
So apparently I have never been that person.
It's less fun being so critical all the time. I used to just be like, this is nice.
Yeah. So apparently my filter, it might be a Boston thing, right? Like, and you have people from the North Shore.
Your standard has always been.
I don't know. You might not argue it's the highest standard, but I think I've always had a very specific relationship to words and sentences. And I mean, and I say this also as a person who read Flowers in the Attic when I was 11, like like all of my peers.
Yeah, right.
So I'm not pretending. I was not reading Shakespeare at 8.
Okay.
But there is a really kind of certain, and I went through my Updike and Cheever and all that kind of stuff. Like, I need to be able to connect with whatever it is I'm reading. And I just found that part of it for me is I need sentences that are a little beyond some things, right? Like I used to be able to recite the last paragraph of Wapshaw Chronicle.
Wow.
Really weird party trick. This is it was Leander's letter.
I won't put you on the spot.
No, I can't. Well, I can't do it anymore. I literally can't do it anymore. But it's this beautiful note from a father to his two sons. And it's a very New England, like, I'm like, I think I've met people who believe this. And I think I was at dinner because their kid was just school. Okay. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, oh, this feels really familiar. I get this.
Yeah.
And I can't do it anymore. But I need to connect with prose. I can't, like, I kind of don't care if I like the characters. I kind of don't care if anything happens.
I like when I don't like the characters.
Right? Like, I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, but I hang on language first. And language and voice to me are sort of inseparable. You and I have this shared love of Daniel Mason's Northwoods. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love this book.
A lot of different voices.
Love this book. Yeah. And, if you haven't read it, it's 400 years in the history of a house and all the people who roll through it. And Mason also is doing a thing where he changes voice in every chapter. So not a lot of people can do this. And it's 400 years. So we're starting with the Puritans in the 1600s and rolling through the present day. It's such a joy to read.
Oh, it's incredible.
This book. And I know you listen to it on audio. And now I'm like, oh, I should.
Yeah.
When am I going to have the time?
Because
but I should do that.
It's read by a cast as, you can really it just makes that distinction between each voice, each generational voice, so stark. And it's really, I mean, yeah, you're right. What's rare is that each voice feels as full and authentic as all the others. You know, I think a lot of times in a kind of polyphonic novel, like one character's voice just feels more like the protagonist and the others are just kind of these other voices. And this does not feel that way. Like the protagonist is the house and the voices are just the vessel. The people are just the vessel to tell the story. I mean, you can even argue America is the protagonist, you know, it's an American story, but just from this one structure in Western Massachusetts.
Western Massachusetts.
It's brilliant. It's so and funny. It's really it's very, very funny and just I really recommend the audio.
And surprising, like good surprising too. Like sometimes you're reading and you're like, oh, okay, thanks. But this was always good surprising. And I was like, okay. And sometimes too, I mean, you'll get a memoir or a novel from a poet, right? You know, I'm thinking Kaveh Akbar and Martyr or Aria Aber's Good Girl or Safiya Sinclair's.
I was just going to say that.
Right. And then I go back to the poetry and I'm like, where have you been all my life? And so this is a reminder to myself that I could stay more up on sort of contemporary poetry, like University of Nebraska Press.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, shout out to the University of Nebraska Press for Safiya Sinclair and Aria Aber's early collections. And I mean, to see what they're doing on the page and sort of listen to them on the page is wild. And I need to break it up. Like, I can't always just read great narrative nonfiction or really good. Like, sometimes I just need a poet to knock me off chair, right?
With a sentence.
Purely for language.
Yeah.
Purely for language.
Completely.
You know, I realize we've been talking around a lot of stuff in Firstborn, and it is a very like, we're not talking novella length, but this is, you said what you had to say, and you said it beautifully. I feel like we could tip into, we gave away some stuff that we didn't want to give away. I mean, personally, I'm hoping that people understand that this is kind of a rare creature, this book, and that it could kick off some conversations that we need to have, kind of thing. And it just brings me back to the idea that I think you share. Books can pretty much get us through anything, yeah?
You know, and I guess you can also define a book in a lot of different ways, you know, like whether or not this book was published, which was its own decision, it exists on my, you know, in my notebooks, on my computer, as just this document, this testament to what happened in my life. And that, you know, so many people have asked me, like, was it cathartic to write this? Again, that implies that it helped. It's not so much helping. It was just the only thing I could do. And I think I actually had a really similar feeling reading Elizabeth McCracken's book, you know, just connecting in some way, whether you're giving or receiving that story, it you know, it doesn't change the course of your life necessarily. It just is life. You know, I think it's a really important part for me of just continuing, you know, and not putting a neat bow on it. You know, it's not happy ending or sad ending or anything. It just is what happened. And it's important to me that document exists. So I'm really grateful to anyone who reads it, even more for readers who connect with it. And I think part of, you know, you asked me at the beginning, how do I feel about this being out there? I think the thing that I am really anxiously looking forward to is hopefully connecting with strangers. You know, hopefully I don't live to regret this, but I do hope to connect with people who have something they want to talk to me about. I want to know what it means to people to read it. Like I know it's kind of like a selfish thing, but of course I want to know that something resonated with someone else. So that's my hope.
And that seems like a really great place. So I'm going to say thank you, Lauren Christensen. I'm so happy to see your face.
It was
and
so
we
nice
made
to
it
see you
through the episode without bursting into tears.
I know.
I'm so impressed. We did this without bawling.
We did it.
Firstborn is out now, and I'm so happy we got to do this.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.